You ever notice how some people don't pull away completely, but they don't step all the way in either? They're friendly, warm even. They listen, they show up, but there's always a small, invisible gap, a half step back. You can talk for hours and still feel like you never quite touch the center of who they are. Maybe you're that person. You're not cold, you're not antisocial. You just feel calmer when there's a little distance, when nothing is expected too fast, when you can breathe without being emotionally cornered. And sometimes you wonder, quietly, why do I feel safer like this? That feeling isn't random, it's not a flaw, and it's definitely not the same as being avoidant, aloof, or emotionally unavailable, even though people love to label it that way. There's a psychology behind why some people trust themselves more when they stay slightly distant, and once you see it, you might recognize yourself or someone you never fully understood. Let's talk about the people who don't disappear, but don't fully merge either, because the distance isn't emptiness, it's a strategy, and sometimes it's wisdom. Picture this. You're at a gathering, not huge, not tiny, comfortable enough. You're engaged in conversation, nodding, smiling, contributing, but you never quite lose yourself in the moment. Part of you is still watching, monitoring, staying upright, emotionally speaking. You're present, but not submerged. That's the first type, the emotional observer. These are people who learned early, often without realizing it, that being fully immersed in other people's emotions can be overwhelming. Not dangerous in a dramatic sense, just draining, confusing, heavy. So instead of shutting down, they developed a softer defense, observation. They listen carefully. They notice tone changes. They read between the lines. They often understand others better than they're understood in return, but they keep their own emotional volume slightly lower. Not because they don't feel deeply. In fact, it's usually the opposite. They feel too much, and staying a little distant gives them a way to regulate that intensity. If you're like this, closeness doesn't scare you. Emotional overload does. You don't want to drown in other people's expectations, moods, or needs, so you stay where you can still see the shore. And here's the quiet irony. People often feel very safe around you without realizing you're the one maintaining the distance. Does that sound familiar? Then there's another profile, a subtler one, the self-contained processor. This is the person who needs space not from people, but from interruption. They don't process emotions out loud. They don't figure it out as they go. Their mind works like a slow, private laboratory. Things need time to settle, to be examined, to make sense internally before being shared. So when relationships move fast, emotionally fast, it feels invasive, not intimate. Too many questions, too much immediacy, too much pressure to respond before they've even understood their own reaction. Distance, for them, isn't a wall, it's a buffer, a place where thoughts can finish forming. If you're this type, you may notice that you open up more after the moment is past, after the conversation, after the emotional wave is already broken. You might think of the perfect thing to say 3 hours later, or realize how you actually felt tomorrow. People sometimes misread this as detachment, but it's not detachment, it's delayed clarity, and staying slightly distant gives you the time your mind needs to stay honest. Then there's the type that surprises people the most, the boundary-sensitive connector. These are people who care deeply about others, but only when there's mutual respect for limits. They've learned, often through experience, that closeness without boundaries leads to emotional sprawl, oversharing, over-explaining, over-giving, so they calibrate their distance carefully, not too far to seem cold, not too close to feel consumed. They don't want to be responsible for regulating someone else's emotional state. They don't want to be leaned on unconsciously. They don't want to become the emotional center of gravity in a relationship. Distance is how they keep relationships healthy. It's how they protect the connection from becoming a burden. If you're this type, you may notice that you enjoy people more when you're not constantly available to them, when there's room for both of you to exist separately. You don't fear intimacy, you fear losing yourself inside it. But here's where things get interesting. There's a type where distance is less about protection and more about identity, the autonomous stabilizer. These are people who feel most grounded when their sense of self is intact and uninterrupted. They don't outsource meaning, validation, or emotional equilibrium to others, not because they're hyper-independent, but because they've learned how fragile inner balance can be when it's constantly influenced by external dynamics. They like relationships, they value connection, but they don't want to merge emotional climates. They want to come together as two complete systems, not one blended one, so they maintain distance as a way to stay anchored. If you're this type, you may notice that intense closeness actually destabilizes you. It makes you feel foggy,
foggy, less clear, less yourself. And distance? Distance brings you back online. It's not avoidance, it's recalibration. Then there's the quietest profile of all, the experience-informed distancer. These are people who weren't always distant. They used to be open, available, maybe even overexposed, until they learned, sometimes painfully, that not everyone handles closeness responsibly, that some people confuse access with entitlement, vulnerability with obligation, openness with availability. So instead of hardening, they adjusted. They stayed kind, they stayed engaged, they just stopped giving immediate access to their inner world. Distance became a filter. Not everyone gets the same depth anymore, and that's intentional. If you're this type, your distance isn't defensive, it's discerning. You're not protecting yourself from connection, you're protecting the quality of it. Now here's the part most people miss. Feeling safer being slightly distant doesn't mean you're bad at relationships. It often means you're good at self-regulation. You know what overwhelms you. You know what drains you. You know where you start losing clarity. So you stay close enough to connect, but far enough to stay steady. That's not emotional unavailability. That's emotional intelligence shaped by experience. Of course, distance can become a problem when it becomes rigid, when it blocks intimacy instead of shaping it, when it becomes a habit rather than a choice. But that's a different story. The kind of distance we're talking about here is flexible, responsive, conscious. It expands when needed, contracts when safe, and it's often misunderstood because it doesn't fit the cultural narrative that closeness should always be maximal, immediate, and intense. But for many people, safety doesn't live in emotional fusion. It lives in clarity, choice, space. So if you've ever felt guilty for needing a little distance, or wondered why being all in feels unsettling, or noticed that you show up better when you don't give everything at once, you're not broken, you're calibrated. And the real question isn't why you stay slightly distant, it's how well you listen to what that distance is telling you. So let me ask you, gently, which of these felt like you, and is your distance protecting you or guiding you? If this made something click, sit with it. And if you want to explore more of the quiet patterns people rarely talk about, you know where to find me.
And here's something else worth noticing. People who feel safer being slightly distant often have a very accurate sense of when closeness turns from nourishing into noisy. They feel the shift before they can explain it. A subtle tightening, a mental fatigue, a desire to step back just enough to hear their own thoughts again. That sensitivity isn't common, and because it's not common, it's often misinterpreted. Someone might say you're hard to get close to, when in reality, you're just careful about how closeness is built. Someone else might assume you don't care as much, simply because you don't perform intimacy loudly. No emotional fireworks, no constant reassurance, no dramatic declarations. But intimacy doesn't only exist in intensity. Sometimes it exists in consistency, in quiet presence, in showing up without consuming or being consumed. People who are slightly distant often love in ways that are less visible but more stable. They remember details, they track patterns, they notice shifts in mood long before words are spoken. They just don't always announce what they're doing. And that creates a strange dynamic. Others may feel deeply understood by you while still wishing you'd let them in more. That tension between being known and being accessed is where distance often lives. Now, here's the part that's uncomfortable to admit. Distance can also be a way of preserving dignity. When you stay slightly removed, you're less likely to overreact, less likely to chase validation, less likely to collapse emotionally when things don't go as hoped. You're not unaffected, you're just not destabilized. And for people who value inner equilibrium, that matters more than appearing emotionally expressive. But, and this is important, distance works best when it's chosen, not automatic. When you know why you're stepping back, when you can step forward too. The danger isn't distance itself. The danger is unconscious distance, when it becomes a reflex rather than a tool. So here's a quiet self-check. Do you feel safer being slightly distant because it keeps you grounded, or because closeness still feels unpredictable? Those are very different answers, and neither one makes you weak. One means you've learned your rhythm. The other means there's still something unresolved. Not wrong, just unfinished. And often, people move between both over time. You might recognize moments where distance feels calm and spacious, and others where it feels lonely but familiar. That doesn't mean you should force closeness. It means you should get curious about what your nervous system is protecting and what it might be ready to release.
Because the goal isn't to become closer or more distant. The goal is to become intentional, to know when distance is helping you stay whole and when it's quietly keeping you from being fully met. People who feel safest being slightly distant often have rich inner lives. They think deeply. They notice subtlety. They value meaning over noise. They don't want to be everywhere emotionally. They want to be somewhere real. So if this video felt uncomfortably accurate or strangely validating, sit with that. You don't need to change your nature. You just need to understand it and maybe trust it a little more consciously. So I'll leave you with this. When you take that half step back, are you avoiding something or are you giving yourself the space to show up better? Tell me which one it is for you.